All right, in this video, I'm going to talk about something kind of different. We're going to talk about complex numbers. Complex numbers, which mostly deal with imaginary numbers. So I want to start off this conversation just about what in the world are they? Well, we ended up with a dilemma. Let's think about 1 squared and negative 1 squared. 1 squared and negative 1 squared. 1 squared is going to be 1 times 1, which equals 1. Negative 1 squared is negative 1 times negative 1, which negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. So what we can say is 1 squared equals 1, and we can say negative 1 squared also equals 1. Since we can say that 1 squared equals 1 and negative 1 squared equals 1, then we can also say, let's say I took the square root of both sides. Then therefore we know that the square root of 1 squared is just 1 equals the square root of 1. And it's the square root of negative 1, so negative 1 also is the same thing as the square root of 1. All right. So we could also say, for example, I know there's a lot of 1s, so you should probably get confused. So let's do one. We can say that 2 is the square root of 4. But we also could say that negative 2 is also the square root of 4. So just thinking about it, why is this the case? Well, because 2 squared is 4, but negative 2 squared, make sure we put in the parentheses, is the same thing as negative 2 times negative 2. Negative times a negative is still a positive, so it also is 4. What in the world does that have anything to do with anything? Well, think about it. If negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4, and 2 times 2 is also positive 4, then what in the world does this mean? What in the world does this mean? It can't be 2, because we know 2 squared is 4. It can't be negative 2, because negative 2 squared is also 4. So how do we deal with this? Well, in the reals, you can't. So that's why we came up with a new number, I. And we define I to be the square root of negative 1. So we got I is the square root of negative 1. To that, think about then I squared must be the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1, which is just going to be negative 1. In other words, let's say I wanted to figure out what two numbers multiply to give me negative 4. Well, that would have to be 2i times 2i. Why? Because 2 times 2 is 4. I times I is I squared. I squared is negative 1, so that gives us negative 4. So just to recap, I is the square root of negative 1. I squared is just negative 1. As a matter of fact, there's a whole family of i's. What I mean by that is they go in rotation. So if I is the square root of negative 1, I squared is going to be negative 1. I to the cube would be negative 1 and then another square root of negative 1. And then I to the fourth, well, that'd be negative 1 times negative 1 because I squared is negative 1. So that's just positive 1. Now you'll notice that it just keeps going in this pattern. I fifth, then a square root of negative 1. I to the 6 is -1, and it keeps going in this pattern. The main thing that you're going to want to know is the fact that I is the square root of -1, and I squared is -1. Notice I squared is not 1. I squared is -1. So let's deal with these. What if I have the square root of -36? Well, I can break that up. It's the square root of -1 times the square root of 36. We know what the square root of 36 is. It's just 6. We know the square root of -1. Remember, we've defined the square root of -1 to be I. And normally we'll just write it as 6I. That's it. Let's do another one. Suppose I have the square root of -8. Well, that right there is just going to be the square root of -1 times the square root of 8. Well, the square root of 8, if we think about it, I can break 8 up into 4 times 2, and I can break 4 up into 2 times 2. And remember, whenever we have a pair of prime factors, they get married and they become 1. What do I mean by that? Well, if you have a square root of -1 times the square root of 2 times 2 times 2, which is what 8 is, right? 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8. Those are just those prime factors there. Then what we're really going to do is whenever we have a pair, it's like they're all single inside of this house, right? When you have a pair, they get married, they become 1, and they come out of their singleness. So now this pair has gotten married, they now are 2 root 2. Now, we know the square root of -1 is an I term. So we've got I times 2 root 2. But the way we'll rearrange it is just to have the real part first, the 2 first, then the I, then the radical.